Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you so much for joining us for this digital presentation today. This is hosted by the Emory Alumni Association and the International Alumni Networks. I'm very excited for everyone to join us and hear from some great experts on the history of philanthropy today. Two quick pieces of housekeeping. This presentation is being recorded and will be sent to everyone who registered later today. And secondly, we'd love for you to submit your questions to our presenters in the Q&A box. As the questions come up, please do put those in our box and we will save those to the end and ask those to the presenters. If you have any questions, you can chat me directly. With that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Katie Bush, to introduce our esteemed guests.
Thanks, Lane, and thank you to everyone who joined today for the History of Educational Philanthropy in America and Britain with Cahoon Family Professor of American History, Dr. Patrick Allitt. As Lane said, I'm Katie Bush, Executive Director of International Advancement and Constituent Engagement, and delighted to open today's program with another webinar in what's actually become a series highlighting Emory faculty and our international alumni communities. I'm pleased to partner with our volunteer leadership in the United Kingdom, Alicia Zhu and Leila Sokolu, to bring this digital event to you today, and especially delighted to welcome our esteemed moderator, Susan Cahoon. Susan is a 1968 graduate of Emory College, an Emory University trustee emerita, and continues to serve as an active Emory volunteer leader on the Development and Communications Committee of the Board of Trustees. A partner at the law firm of Kilpatrick, Townsend, and Stockton, Susan joined the firm after graduating from Harvard Law School and has spent her entire career as a litigator, becoming her firm's first female partner in 1977. Susan concentrates on patent and complex commercial litigation and is a fellow in the American College of Trial Lawyers. While at Emory, Susan majored in economics, was a highly successful debater with the Barclay Forum, and active in many campus organizations. As an alumna, she continued her Emory involvement as president of the Atlanta chapter, member of the Board of Governors and Board of Visitors, and was recognized by the Emory College of Arts and Sciences with its Alumni Award of Distinction. In 2009, she was elected as a trustee and became an emerita trustee in 2018. I'll now pass the program on to Susan, who will introduce Emory's Cahoon Family Professor of American History, Dr. Patrick Allitt, and will moderate questions after Professor Allitt's presentation. Susan?
Thanks very much, Lane. It's a pleasure to have all of you with us today that are participating in this webinar. I think you're about to enjoy a particularly engaging opportunity to learn something, because that's always what happens, I think, when you have an opportunity to hear Patrick Allitt speak. He is the first holder of the Cahoon Family Chair, and I guess one reason for linking the two of us today is the subject matter, since I had a great commitment to Emory from my personal experiences there, which were very formative for the rest of my professional career, and I wanted to do something to give back to the university. I chose the history area, where I actually had more hours than economics. We didn't recognize double majors back in the day. Because of my belief that it's so important that we have firm groundings in history to understand what's happening in the world, even as we're seeing it today. I knew the right person had been picked for this the first time I met Patrick and just talked with him, with his engaging accent, which you'll soon hear. Though he got an Oxford degree, he didn't pick up sort of the Oxbridge accent affectation that remains a Derbyshire lad to this day, with a delightful Midland sound that I think, as all Americans do, we quickly fall in love with. He also is someone who loves to teach. If you haven't ever seen his book, I'm the Teacher, You're the Student, you'll understand how this person brings to the classroom innovative techniques to engage his students and make history come alive, and also establish the proper role and respect between teacher and student to foster good learning practices. So it's a real pleasure for me to be able to present Dr. Patrick Allitt to talk with us about the history of philanthropy in Britain and the United States as it relates to higher education. Patrick?
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and that's a very generous introduction. Now, I'm one of many people who, since the COVID crisis began, has been stuck inside, and I'm very, very grateful to be literate. because I think how boring it would be to be in the COVID crisis and not even be able to read. So I have been saying little prayers of thanks to the people who taught me how to read a long time ago. That starts you thinking about education and particularly about universities. It's easy to forget, we're so familiar with universities, it's easy to forget that throughout most of world history there weren't any. And so one of the questions I'm interested in today is, why did universities begin? Who paid for them? Who went to them? And under what conditions and in what relationship to the rest of society have they developed and matured? And we know a lot about the history of universities because they've always been concentrations of people who are both literate and very articulate. And so especially when we go back into medieval history, when almost the only literate people were the monks and the priests, the places where they tended to be and the things they tended to write about were closely connected with higher education. So I want to begin in Britain, way back about 1,000 years ago, when England or Britain was still, or England was still a Catholic country. And as I say, most of the literate people were monks. And all the good libraries were at monasteries. Even many members of the aristocracy and some royalty were illiterate, so the church was the guardian of literacy. Now, the secular church, that is the Catholic Church, which was not monastic, also needed secular priests. And so the bishops of the various different dioceses around England would send their seminarians to monasteries where they knew there were talented teachers, monks who were good at teaching. One of the places was where the oxen forded the River Thames, Oxford. And another of these places was where the bridge went over the River Cambridge. That's the origin of the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. They're places where talented monastic teachers would teach young seminarians, aspiring priests, who'd been sent from the different districts around the country by their bishops. So in those days, the actual funding came from tithes. Everybody was required to pay 1/10 of his income to the church. It was often bitterly resented, but that was the rules at the time. And the bishops of the different English districts began to build houses in Oxford and Cambridge to house the priests or the trainee priests from their districts, because it was prestigious for the bishop to build a beautiful house in place. If you've had the good fortune to visit Oxford or Cambridge, you'll know that the colleges are breathtakingly beautiful and that they're far more elaborate than they need to be for their function, because all they really do is house the students. And the reason for that is that the bishops were competing with one another for prestige to build the most gorgeous house for their seminarians to be contained. I was a student at Oxford in the 1970s. I was at Hertford College. And even in my day, even in the late 20th century, there were still fairly strong regional associations with the various different colleges. So the people at Queen's College were mainly from the north, because originally it had been founded by the Bishop of Durham. The people at Jesus College were mainly from Wales, and so on. Now, education has always been expensive, and it remains expensive right up to the present. One of the things that students complain to me about is how much the books cost. But I tell them, no, the books are an absolute miracle of cheapness. Think what books used to cost in the days before the printing press. Very often, a pre-printing press book was more valuable than a house. Imagine the labor involved for a monk to actually copy out the entire Bible by hand, and the amount of vellum or parchment you'd need. You need the skins of 20 or 30 sheep. It was more than a year's work to do a Bible. And so a book was an incredibly expensive object. One of the best places to get a sense of that is at Merton College, Oxford, where the old library, which is a medieval building, has great locks and chains where the books were locked to the desks. They were the single most valuable thing in the college, and they were very carefully kept there. Now, before the Reformation, the idea was widespread that literacy is dangerous and that it ought to be confined to a small minority of people, really the priests only. Otherwise, if ordinary people started reading the Bible, they'd get into heresy, they might get political ideas and become rebellious. If you've ever read Umberto Eco's novel, The Name of the Rose, there's a wonderful debate in there in which this is a modern Italian novelist. He imagines the debate among the monks about the rights and wrongs of letting ordinary people learn to read. But at the end of it, they all throw up their hands and say, well, that's never going to happen, is it? Literacy is always going to be a radical minority interest. Well, two things began to change that situation. The first was the invention of the printing press in the 1400s. And the second was the Protestant Reformation in the early 1500s, because those two things led to a complete revolution, first of all, in the idea about the rights and wrongs of literacy, and second, in access to affordable reading. Once it was possible to turn out several hundred copies of a book and to do it quickly, the price of reading materials came down and down and down. And in fact, it's really been going down ever since. So the books comparatively cost far less now than they ever have done previously. The great Protestant reformers, Martin Luther and John Calvin and Zwingli, some of the others, believe very strongly that the individual should have the opportunity to read. Luther expressed it in the phrase, the priesthood of all believers, the idea that there's a direct relationship between the individual and God, and that therefore God's word, embodied in the Bible, should be read by the individual himself or herself. Now, higher education in Northern Europe, that is the countries which did go over to the Protestant Church, England, Denmark, North Germany, Sweden, the Scandinavian countries. There, what tended to happen is that the funding still came partly from the church, but it also came from prosperous merchants, people who'd made a fortune in business. And instead of giving the money for masses to be said for their souls, as such people would have done in the Catholic days, now said that they give money for the funding of higher education to make it possible for more people to learn to read. Now, of the two British universities, or the two English universities, Cambridge was the one which developed a stronger Puritan tradition. The word Puritan really began as an insult. It was one of those insults that's taken up by the people to whom it's given as a badge of honor. And they said, yes, we are Puritans. We want to purify the Church of England of all Catholic vestiges because we want to get rid of the dreadful superstition under which Britain used to labor. And as you know, many of or some of these Puritans actually took the dramatic step of crossing the Atlantic Ocean to settle in Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay. Many of the first generation of Massachusetts Puritans were themselves educated at Cambridge, so it's no surprise that when they set up a little college town of their own, they should call it Cambridge. That's where Cambridge, Massachusetts came from. Now, a gift of money and books given by John Harvard in 1638 led to his name going on the college, and that's a tradition that's been continued ever since. The reason for the founding of this college, the first one in the colonies, to quote now from the founding document, was to advance learning and perpetuate it to posterity, dreading to leave an illiterate ministry to the churches when our present ministers shall lie in the dust. So there we are, right from the outset. The reason for Harvard's coming into existence was to train Puritan clergy. Between the 1630s, when it was founded, and the 1770s, when the American Revolution took place, it remained mainly a seminary for training ministers. But gradually, the sons of gentlemen started to go there as well, so that they could learn, they could improve their literacy, they could learn a little bit of the ancient languages, they could learn some mathematics, study law. That was a prominent thing right from the start. And in a few cases, even study some science. There's a famous story about how in the 1770s, just before the revolution began, the president of the University of Pennsylvania heard about a wonderful instrument that had been made by David Rittenhouse. Rittenhouse was a scientific instrument maker, and he'd made an orrery. An orrery is a model of the solar system in which by cranking a handle, you can cause the planets to turn. The moon rotates around the earth and the planets rotate around the sun. Anyway, they thought this was such a marvel that the entire annual budget of the university one year was devoted to buying David Rittenhouse's orrery. So that's a sign that more than just religious education was going on there. And there was a great enthusiasm for literacy in the colonial period. many of you will have read Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. And if you haven't read it yet, it's a great treat in store, because there's some wonderful passages there about how the colonial tradesmen, people like Franklin, a colonial printer, he set up America's first lending library, and he brought together his friends in a club called the Junto, which was a self-improvement society where the members learned topics, read papers that they'd written to each other to help them become more learned. So that was a kind of do-it-yourself university, which was very common in towns in colonial America. Now, after the Revolution, in the early American Republic, many of the states founded their own universities. This was partly to train good Republican citizens in the traditions of the Revolution, and it was partly for the individual prestige of the state. University of Georgia, for example, was chartered in 1785. And it was a common pattern after that, as the line of settlement spread westwards across the continent. You can very often look at the date at which the state came into existence, and then you'll find that 10 or 12 or 15 years later, the state university came into existence. And again, this was one of the things that a new state did to establish its credibility, its plausibility. For example, I was a graduate student at the University of California in Berkeley, and looking into it, I found that this pattern pertains exactly. Until 1848, California was part of Mexico, but it was won by the United States away from Mexico in the War of 1846 to 48. 2 years later, during the gold rush, it became a state. And then the University of California at Berkeley was founded in 1868. And it was funded partly by state funds, partly by tuition, and partly by philanthropy. People like Phoebe Hearst. Phoebe Hearst was the daughter of a man who'd made $1 million in the gold rush. She inherited, in fact, more than that, she inherited 10 million from her father and endowed and used much of it to endow the university. She was the mother of the famous newspaperman, William Randolph Hearst. So each state, or nearly every state, got a university of its own, which was secular. Nearly all the other colleges in America in the 19th century were seminaries for the training of clergy. And very, very often you'll find, if you look back in the history of a college which has got a founding date between 1800 and 1870, its founding was done by a particular church. And in fact, Emory fits into this pattern because it was founded in 1836 out in Oxford, Georgia, rather than here in Atlanta. But not strictly as a seminary. It was a secular college for the training of young Methodist men, and didn't actually become a seminary until Emory moved into Atlanta in 1914, when Urban Emory was created, when the Candler School of Theology was founded. One of the big issues among the Methodists, obviously that's the strongest tradition for Emory itself, was the question of whether their ministers should be chosen directly by God. In other words, whether the hand of God reached down and seized someone and said, "You're now the minister," which is one of the early Methodist traditions, or whether the ministers should have a formal education. And as the sober, hardworking Methodists gradually prospered, they started to favor the educated ministers method, which of course again was an incentive for increasing their higher education. Now, by the late 19th century, after about 1870, it became increasingly common for a new source of funding, a new source of inspiration and payment for universities to come into effect. And this was funding by the big industrialists. People like John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie and Vanderbilt. These were people who made gigantic fortunes. They were some of the richest people in the entire history of the entire world. But although they were very rich, they tended to have mixed reputations. Some of them were nicknamed the robber barons, the implication being that they'd stolen the money from hardworking, ordinary people. And so they decided that one of the things they needed to do to improve their reputation was to devote some of their fortunes to high-minded activity. And there's no more obvious example than educational philanthropy, sanitization through education. So think about this, for example. Vanderbilt was founded in 1873. Cornelius Vanderbilt himself had made a fortune in ferry boats, shipping, and railroads. Stanford University, founded in 1885. Leland Stanford had made a fortune also as a railroad builder, building half of the first transcontinental railroad, which had been finished back in 1869. University of Chicago, founded in 1902. entirely funded by John D. Rockefeller, probably the richest man in the world, who'd made his great fortune in the oil business starting in the late 1850s. It didn't bear his name. He was modest enough not to want his name on it, which is relatively unusual. Duke University, 1926. Duke had made a fortune in the tobacco business, and his name was placed on an older Methodist college in exchange for large financial gifts. So he was doing in the 1920s what John Harvard had done back in the 1630s, that is, give the money in exchange for the name. Now, with Andrew Carnegie, it was a little bit different. Carnegie himself came from Scotland to America as a penniless immigrant, worked his way up through a combination of skill and hard work and good luck, and became the central figure in the American iron and steel business in the late 1800s. And by the time he retired to devote himself full-time to philanthropy, Carnegie was dissatisfied with the universities. He said, we need more scientific and technical training in universities to get people ready so that they can have technical careers in industry. The kind of rule of thumb man on the shop floor wasn't good enough because of the increasing sophistication of the technical business. So let me read you a passage of a speech that Andrew Carnegie made in 1889, where he's criticizing the way in which a lot of higher education was developing. Andrew Carnegie says, "Men have sent their sons to college to waste their energies upon obtaining a knowledge of such languages as Greek and Latin, which are of no more practical use to them than Choctaw. They have been educated as if they were destined for life upon some other planet than this. They have in no sense received instruction. On the contrary, what they have obtained has served to imbue them with false ideas and to give them a distaste for practical life. I do not wonder that a prejudice has arisen and still exists against such an education. In my own experience, I can say that I have known few young men intended for business who were not injured by a collegiate education. Had they gone into active work during the years spent at college, they would have been better educated men in every true sense of that term. The fire and energy have been stamped out of them. And how so to manage as to live a life of idleness and not a life of usefulness has become the chief question with them." Isn't that fascinating? This idea that, well, the very last thing you want for your kid is for them to go to college. I never meet parents, middle-class parents of teenagers these days who say, I hope my kid doesn't go to college. I think that would cause trouble down the road. Another very interesting writing from Carnegie, he was a very enthusiastic writer as well, was an essay called The Gospel of Wealth, in which he said it's a crime to die rich. In other words, he was a very enthusiastic supporter of the capitalist system, which had made him wealthy. But he said, I've now got a responsibility to distribute this wealth as widely as possible so that others can benefit from my good fortune. And sure enough, he endowed libraries all over the English-speaking world, and you can still see them in England and Scotland and all over America and Canada and even in Australia and South Africa. And he endowed various foundations, which are still going strong. And later, he did actually soften his educational views a little bit. So I assure you that if you go to Carnegie Mellon University, you can, in fact, study Latin and Greek, the ancient languages that he so despised. And you can even study things like art history, which when he first spoke, he'd regarded with great disdain. Now, another of the very interesting issues, which has got a kind of continuing resonance today, although it's much fainter than it used to be, was this question. If you pay for a university, are you then entitled to decide what goes on inside it? And at first, the answer was definitely yes. The early donors wanted close control over who was going to be hired on the faculty, what kind of students were going to come in, what kind of discipline was going to be imposed, and what could and could not be said. For example, after Leland Stanford died, his widow, Jane Stanford, became the sole trustee of Stanford University. She was completely in charge of it. And in 1896, she told the president of Stanford, David Starr Jordan, that he must fire one of the economics professors. This was a man called Edward Ross. Why? Because Ross had spoken in favor of the Democratic candidate in the 1896 presidential election, a man called William Jennings Bryan. She was so horrified at the idea of Ross speaking up for Bryan that she told Jordan, right, you've got to fire him. Anyway, Jordan, the president, was deeply uncomfortable about this and said, but Mrs. Stanford, he's a very prominent economist. To which her answer was, I don't care, I'm not going to stand for him. And so the result was that Ross was fired, and nearly all the other members of the economics department resigned in protest. So the result was that the econ department suddenly lost all its illustrious members and took 20 or 30 years to recover its dignity. And incidentally, Mrs. Stanford herself died in mysterious circumstances. She was murdered with strychnine poisoning 10 years later in a famous American murder case that was never solved. Not that I'm implying that this was cause and effect. Anyway, the question of academic freedom is a very interesting one. Professors have fought very hard to get it. They want to be free to say and to write and to research and to teach whatever they think is true. For obvious reasons, the philanthropists and the administrators have sometimes been eager to restrain them from doing it. Now, it was in the late 19th century that the first women's colleges also started to pop up. One of them was Vassar in Poughkeepsie, New York. Matthew Vassar was a successful brewer in Poughkeepsie, and his niece persuaded him that a college for women was needed. He was a very likable fellow. He'd worked for the Underground Railroad, helping to free slaves. He'd even bought some slaves in order to free them in the years before the Civil War. He persuaded the legislature of the state of New York to pass the appropriate act, which they did. And then he actually handed over to the trustees a tin with $408,000 in cash as the operating money for the building of the college. And it's gone on from strength to strength ever since. Closer to home, Agnes Scott, which is one of Emory's neighbors, was founded by George Washington Scott in 1890 in honor of his mother. He named it after his mother. He was an ex-Confederate general who'd made $1 million in the fertilizer business here in Atlanta and gave the money for the creation of a women's academy. Now, these kinds of traditions of people who'd made fortunes in industry giving money to higher education continued throughout the 20th century. A famous example, which is very close to our hearts, is the gift given by Robert Woodruff in 1979, where he gave to Emory $105 million. At the time, it was the single biggest gift in the entire history of American educational philanthropy. And of course, it was the gift which permitted Emory to complete its transformation from being a regional, segregated boys' college into a first-rank research university with a worldwide reach, which obviously it is today. Robert Woodruff and his brother George gave another $100 million over the course of their lifetimes, and certain other families like the Candler and the Rollins families, whose names you see on many objects all over the campus, were similarly extremely generous benefactors to Emory in those formative years. Now, let me jump back to Britain for a moment. By contrast, there wasn't the same kind of tradition of individual philanthropy did not develop there. And of course, it's an interesting question why it ought not to have done. First of all, higher education was much slower to catch on in Britain it was much less democratic for much longer. It wasn't really till after World War II, when the Labour government of Clement Attlee came into office, that it began to expand. And one of the things that the Attlee government did, this is a Labour Party government, was to nationalise the entire university system, including Oxford and Cambridge. Between 1945 and 1970, 25 new British universities were founded to complement Oxford, Cambridge, London, and the 7 or 8 older ones, which dated back before 1900. And the Labour government took the view, not only will the government fund them, it will also fund the students themselves. It will pay their tuition, it will give them grants, and this will create the opportunity for talented working class students to go to college, whether their families can afford it or not. This is a system of which I'm a direct beneficiary. My degree program at Oxford cost my family almost nothing. The expectation was that the nation as a whole benefits from having a more highly educated population, and therefore the nation collectively should pay for it. So a very different model than the American one. Now, since my day, I graduated from college back in 1977, almost imaginably long ago now. And since my day, a much larger percentage of each generation has started going to college in the United Kingdom. And the result is that this idea of supporting the system entirely through grants has become unsustainable. So now students do have to pay some of the tuition costs and some of the living costs, although it's still heavily subsidized by American standards. So one of the pleasures for me of going back to Britain is the amusement I get in hearing British kids complain about how much they have to pay, even though by American standards it sounds almost comically little. It still sounds, it is by American standards, a bargain basement deal. Anyway, you see, the British public was educated to expect that the cost of education would be borne by the state and not by philanthropic individuals. Well, let me finish by saying that news stories tell us that higher education is in crisis. Well, it's always in crisis. In other words, there isn't a moment since John Harvard's first generous bequest that American higher education has not been in crisis. And it's true that more money and more facilities and more opportunities would certainly help, and making it more democratic and opening it up to more people in a more affordable way, that would also help. It's very encouraging to see the way in which the big gifts continue to roll in. Last month, big new gifts came to Emory, Oxford, and to Agnes Scott from the Blair family, $8 million each. Some enormous gifts have just been given to Spelman and Morehouse as well by the founder of Netflix TV. But put it in perspective by saying to yourself, where are the best universities in the world? And the answer is they're right here in the United States. Every scientist from whatever country he or she may come wants to do doctoral studies in America or a postdoctoral fellowship, because that's what gives them the seal of credibility anywhere else in the world. Just look at who wins the Nobel Prizes every year, especially the science and economics ones. And what you find is an enormous concentration of Nobel Prize winners right here in the United States. So that's a reminder that, although our institutions certainly have challenges and problems, on the whole, they're doing extremely well. And of course, we should take great pride in their continuing prestige and honor and the continuing appeal of educational philanthropy. Thanks very much. And now I'm going to turn it back to Susan. So she'll ask me some questions. And then if you'd like to ask questions, please put them in the chat function and we'll get to them in the space of the next few minutes. Susan.
As you were reading from some of the quotations of Andrew Carnegie and thinking about crises in higher education, one of the things that struck me was that we are hearing sort of a variant of the Carnegie concern. And that is, particularly given the high cost of higher education in the United States, the parents who are funding it, the students who have the debt when they come out, are all very concerned about immediate remunerative employment opportunities to start repaying the debts. As one who is a great supporter, as reflected in the area I chose to endow a chair in history, this has great implications for private philanthropic support for the humanities type areas of liberal arts. And I'd just be interested in your views about that, and what are the touchstones that is the answer to people who aren't in the engineering and scientific disciplines about why philanthropy should still come for your areas.
It's a very good point, Susan, and it's one about which I've got mixed feelings. On the one hand, I'm also very aware that we have history majors graduating with high debt. If they come from very wealthy families, that's one thing. But if they're going to be saddled with a burden of debt for a long time into the future, that's more troublesome. And of course, as you say, it's harder to make the case that the nation needs lots and lots of history graduates than it is to make the case that we need lots of engineering graduates. I think that's just simply one of the material realities. On the other hand, you clearly believe, and I certainly also believe, that part of the benefits of a liberal arts education is that it's defiantly impractical. That what we're teaching them in the history classroom is not meant to be of utilitarian value. It's meant to make them better citizens, and it's meant to enrich their understanding. But it is, in some respects, a luxury item. And if you look at who becomes a historian, what you find on the whole is that they come from very, very prosperous families. I think for exactly that reason, that it's only from such a population that the idea of becoming a a professional historian seems reasonable. I'm very, very much the exception in this respect. Because of the generosity of you and the University of California and various other people along my career track, I was able to do it. But on the whole, that's much less true. I know that what the university itself wants from donors, I don't know if it ever says it this bluntly, you're more likely to know this than I am. What it really wants is unrestricted funds. It wants to be given lots of money, and it wants to be told you can do whatever you want with it. Because the university itself, certainly Emory and its peer institutions, would like to be able to give plenty of money to students so that they'll graduate with smaller debts, because that in turn will enable them to move further and further down in the middle class, to get middle class students to come here in a way which won't saddle them with an impossible burden of debt afterwards. So it's a complicated question, and it's clearly one in which philanthropists play a very important role. There is a handful of universities, of which Emory I think is one, which has at least considered the possibility of not charging tuition at all. In other words, we've got so much, we've got such resources that we could almost think about saying to students, if you can get in, we'll then pay for you to be here. Harvard is certainly in that position and has thought quite seriously about whether to do it or not. I think that's something we're going to have to watch with interest in the coming years.
I don't think we're quite that close to doing that at Emory, but we certainly have been among some of the leading universities with the needs blind admission policy that says that if you're qualified for admission, we will, through direct financial aid, through loans, through some combination, enable you to come notwithstanding your lack of resources. And we will assure that your debt burden is capped. We will make sure that there's enough free funding for you. That obviously increases the burden on the university from its general revenue, and which is one reason why giving unrestricted funds or giving funds just to generally fund scholarships. If people want a naming opportunity, you can endow a scholarship, which then generates revenues that will support students. So those are some of the dynamics that, from the perspective of somebody who's been a trustee and has been involved in fundraising activities for the university, I can tell you we think a lot about and are concerned about. Other things, like if you endow a professorship, that really reduces pressure on the operating budget and the unrestricted endowment to pay a salary. So it frees up funds that can then further go to help support students.
Right.
The other thing we try to sell, at least I do when I talk about supporting things outside of the more directly, you can get a high paying job as an engineer type approach, is that there's some interesting studies, and you may be familiar with them too, Patrick, that show that if you look at what happens in career success and people that move up in managerial roles within a lot of organizations, the liberal arts types, which seem to have broader perspective and are smart enough to understand enough about the technology in which they're managing, suddenly seem to emerge and catch up and become managers that start having equivalent comp, though it takes them a bit longer to get there. So it's an interesting trade-off about the well-rounded perspective and the opportunities that gives. So there's hope yet for the liberal arts, Patrick. We're going to hang in there.
Yes, I suppose one issue which has never been satisfactorily resolved and never will be is what the students should actually learn. Another of the great differences between British and American education is the way in which in Britain you tend to specialize early. So that when I was an undergraduate at Oxford, my degree course was 3 years long, and every class I did at Oxford was a history class. In other words, that's a system which benefits people who've made up their minds early and want to specialize, but it penalizes rather heavily the ones who are still not sure what they really want to do. And of course, many 18-year-olds are still looking around. In that sense, the American system is a lot more merciful because it gives the students their freshman and sophomore years in which to try all sorts of different things, including disciplines they've probably not studied previously, like anthropology and psychology, which usually aren't taught in the schools. And then when they're better informed, to then make a decision. I've come to believe very strongly in the superiority of the American system in that respect. But I'm still also aware that a price is paid. In other words, a history major leaves Emory knowing less than a British history specialist who graduated from college as well. So there are very strong arguments can be made on both sides, and it's not the kind of problem which is going to be resolved once and for all. It's going to have to be a matter of tendencies.
Why do you think there wasn't a development in Britain of establishing, particularly perhaps in hostility in some quarters, to the nationalization of the universities and the like? Certainly the so-called public schools, which are private, are there up through the high school years. Why someone hasn't thought about founding some private universities that might offer a different kind of training environment to that the state system offers in the UK. Any thoughts about that?
Yes, well, it has just very recently begun to happen. There are now some private business schools, and there's just one place called the University of Buckingham, which is private, and which is obviously based on the American model. I think earlier on, in the 1940s through 80s, really before Mrs. Thatcher became Prime Minister and led to a great transformation in the mood of British public life, there was the feeling that to be wealthy was a little bit shameful. It was clearly desirable. Nearly everybody would rather be wealthy than poor, but you mustn't boast about it, and you mustn't be conspicuous about it by doing things like sending your children to private colleges. You could send them to private high schools, and as you said, the English private high schools are called the public schools, which is a highly confusing thing. But the claim there would be, well, this was just for the sake of the quality of the education. But beyond that, it was regarded as bad form. I think that view has changed it a little bit. But of course, it must be very difficult to establish the principle of private philanthropy if it isn't already customary. And it's very striking, I think, that if you look at private gifts to British universities, they're nearly all from American alumni. Americans who became Marshall Scholars or who became Rhodes Scholars or Fulbrights and spent some time in Britain, when the British college they went to sends them a fundraising letter, they're fully familiar with it because they also get it from UCLA or University of Michigan or Emory, where they were undergraduates. And so they do give. But what's not yet happened on a large scale is that people who went solely through the British system as Brits, they're still not yet ready. They're still not familiar with the idea that this is one of the appropriate uses for surplus wealth.
Interesting. Thinking further about the British and American comparisons, do you know, Patrick, what the general pattern of philanthropy among the UK population versus the US population? I mean, I sometimes hear people claim that Americans generally do more charity proportionately than those in many other countries. I just don't know the data about the UK at all. You may not have seen anything on that.
Right. It's true that the Americans are more philanthropic than the British. Obviously, they're wealthier, so they're in a better position to be able to do so. But British giving goes more heavily to things like Oxfam, Save the Children, Doctors Without Borders. In other words, money which is devoted to helping improving the welfare of severely disadvantaged people. And very often it's severely disadvantaged people who live overseas. One of the criticisms of it, which I've heard in Britain, is that it's so remote that the donor doesn't have very much sense of whether the money ultimately reached its intended beneficiary. I mean, I imagine that from your point of view, one of the great benefits of giving to Emory, to which you're so close, is that you can actually witness the use that the money has been put to up close and personally in a way that a donor to Oxfam never can.
True. One final thing that I wanted you to comment on and get your thoughts on before we start taking some of our audience questions. Naming. And obviously, I decided I wanted to identify closely with Emory because it was important to me, and I wanted to do something that perpetuates my own name and that association and that of my family with Emory. You talked about the giving to sort of improve reputation. we've certainly seen some highly publicized recent situations where universities were rather embarrassed by recent donors and have been taking a look at historical issues about the names on some of their buildings. I mean, I'm thinking of Harvey Weinstein having pledged $5 million to Southern Cal, also a Methodist-founded school, for women in the film industry. An interesting conjunction of from Harvey. And Jeffrey Epstein gave a bunch of money to Harvard, and Harvard has looked at the royal gifts of a couple hundred years ago almost that have resulted in things like the shield that identified the law school. It has been dropped because the royal family made its money in the British slave trade back in the day. Things like that. So are people being successful or not, or how are universities approaching this issue of, particularly when you put the name on a building?
That's a question I'm also very interested in. And I was a member of a committee at Emory to decide whether we needed to, well, in fact, we did. We came up with a series of principles governing the naming of buildings and professorships and so on. And as you say, there have been some fascinating cases recently. I think it's relatively easy for a university to decline a gift if it hasn't been given yet. In other words, Southern California said no to Harvey Weinstein at a time when he was already in serious trouble. By contrast, he'd earlier given some money to Rutgers to fund the Gloria Steinem Chair of Women's Studies. There's something like Women in Communications Media. And the people at Rutgers didn't want to give the money back. They wanted to hold on to it. And they made the claim, I mean, the obvious defense you'd make of holding on is to say, even if the money came from a tainted source, what we're doing now is that we're transforming it. In effect, we're washing the money by diverting its bad origins into something very good. There's a wonderful play by George Bernard Shaw called Major Barbara, which addresses this question exactly. It's about a cynical British brewery magnate, or a whiskey distiller, I guess he is. And his daughter is converted to the Salvation Army, which obviously are teetotalers and they're very strict and puritanical. And the father, to win back his daughter's affection, offers to give £1 million to the Salvation Army. And most of the members of the Salvation Army are excited to get the money, but she herself says, we can't accept that money, it's tainted. Anyway, and the play is a brilliant investigation, a discussion of the rights and wrongs of whether they ought to accept it or whether they ought not to, and whether she's standing in the institution's way by refusing to take it. Another very good example would be the Rhodes Scholarship. Obviously, there's no more prestigious award that an American undergraduate can win at the end of his or her college life than a Rhodes Scholarship. But Cecil Rhodes, by our standards, is an incredible villain. He was a racial supremacist. He set up what was in effect his own kingdom in Africa. He used African slave laborers in the diamond mines at Kimberley. You can easily make an extremely adverse case for Cecil Rhodes. But of course, the Rhodes Scholarship, the name is now so strong that many people know the positive associations and don't even know about Rhodes himself. So I expect that what will happen there is that the Rhodes Trust will hang on to it and the Rhodes Scholarships will continue to be offered with the justification, we've turned something with bad origins into something much better. What would happen to the money if we didn't use it? Could we be confident that it would go to even better uses? And if not, let's not be too ashamed. One thing that did surprise me greatly in the last few months was that the Woodrow Wilson Center at Princeton, the Center for Political Scientists, International Affairs, has taken Woodrow Wilson's name off the place. I mean, it's true that he was a segregationist, but he lived in a world full of segregationists. In other words, I don't think he was an exceptionally virulent one. He wasn't a Klan member. And he was president, and he did introduce the principle of human rights as an active component of foreign policy. So I would have thought in that case that the offsetting merits of Woodrow Wilson's case ought to have spoken in his favor, but clearly among the people at Princeton who made the decisions, it didn't. So that's a very interesting example.
I think we ought to make sure we get as many of our audience questions as we can. I think there's some in queue.
Thank you so much. Our first questions come, are there any universities that charge differential tuition with tuition based on potential earning capacity, where tuition is being lowered for history and English majors than for science and engineering majors?
Not that I know of. It may be that behind the scenes, scholarship committees are aware of the differential prospects for students' earnings after the fact, but I've never heard a declared policy of differential tuition. It would be interesting to see how that shifted undergraduates' decision about what major to take. Because I've certainly often had the experience of knowing a student who said, I'd love to be a history major, but I can't because my family needs me to become a doctor, or my family expects me to become a businessman, and this just doesn't seem relevant enough. It would be lovely in the future to see, we do have schemes like this, schemes which say, if you go into public service for a certain number of years, the university will offer forgiveness of some of the debt you owe. In other words, that's a social service for debt forgiveness program. And imaginative boards of trustees and administrators can certainly come up with ways to incentivize the taking of what would otherwise look like non-lucrative majors. Certainly, when you read the stories in the Chronicle of Higher Education at the moment, one of the things they're always lamenting is the way in which humanities departments are shrinking in size, particularly at the non-elite schools. It doesn't affect us very much at Emory, but it certainly affects branch campuses of the University of Georgia and branch campuses of the University of Wisconsin, things like that.
Thank you so much. This is a two-part question from parents who live in the UK and their children are attending Emory. Could you speak a little bit to the value of an Emory education outside of Oxbridge? And the second part is, why do you think Europeans don't have the same charitable view of the colleges?
Well, to answer the second half first, I think it's that you're never grateful for something which you think of as a right. In other words, the first generation of Americans who had to fight for the right to vote really appreciated the fact that they could vote. But once the vote was simply something that you were born with and had always got, your feeling of gratitude towards having it tended to evaporate. And that's why we've now got the astonishing situation where on many election days, less than half of the people who've got the right to vote don't even bother to exercise that right. 2 days ago, this Tuesday, we had runoff elections here in Georgia, and most of the people who had the right to vote didn't even bother. I think that's one thing. And the good thing about the post-World War II British Labour government was that it said we want to extend educational opportunity to everyone, and we don't want economic barriers to stand in the way of talented working class kids from getting an education. The downside of it was that very, very quickly it came to be regarded as a right. So that, I mean, I remember clearly when I was an undergraduate in the mid-70s, even though by contemporary American standards, we had an almost miraculously favorable set of terms, given this first-class education at no charge to us. What hardly any of us expressed was a sense of gratitude. No, we said this is our right. In fact, there was a powerful organization called the National Union of Students, the NUS, and the leadership were members of Maoist factions. And they were furious at what they said was the reactionary government in being so stingy. They wanted to be given a lot more. Anyway, so that's the answer to the second question. The answer to the first question, I would say that an undergraduate, a British undergraduate from anywhere now gets a better undergraduate education at Emory than at Oxford. Although Oxford still has the tutorial system, it's still hamstrung by the fact that the students are asked to specialize too early. For some of them, it's great. I think if you're a really, really single-minded mathematician and all you want to do is study math, and you go into Oxford determined to do it really well and really powerfully, it's great. But of course, the vast majority of 18-year-olds are adolescent. They're at the end of their adolescence, but they're still not single-minded and dedicated and don't yet have a narrow life purpose and path. But I think that the British universities, especially Oxford and Cambridge, expect it of you, and they expect it too early. I'd welcome a situation in which the degree programs were extended from 3 years to 4, as they are here, and in which far more opportunity was given to the students in the early stages so that they didn't have to make premature decisions.
Thank you so much. That's excellent. I think we have time for one last question. And the question is looking at other traditions of philanthropy in other parts of the world. And this context is centered around thinking of the ever-increasing number of international students and alumni in U.S. schools. Could you speak to any other philanthropy in different parts of the world?
Not really, no. I don't really know enough about it. I think, for example, in a place like China, it must be very difficult to be philanthropic because the communist government still tries to keep its finger on the pulse of all activities and is much less enthusiastic about voluntary activities than we are here in the United States because of the possibility that it'll have political side effects. And so I expect that philanthropy is less well developed in China, which has also transformed itself on the basis of the idea of an omnipotent state. This is one of the great differences between America and most of the rest of the world. I mean, in America, there's a lively, sometimes a morbid fear of government. The government is always in danger of becoming an adversary. That feeling is much less strong in most other places in the world. Government instead is looked at more as a savior, a source of opportunities, a source of blessings and benefits. And as I mentioned in talking about England, as a source of rights. If you've got rights, it's because the government has given them to you. Again, it's Americans who tend to take the view, or some Americans, look out or the government will take your rights away from you. In other words, you've got them first, and if you're not vigilant, you'll lose them. That's a very unusual view elsewhere. In places like India, there's a lot of philanthropy, but it still tends to be predominantly religious. In other words, if you look at how Hindu temples survive, it's mainly through the giving of the Brahmins, the upper castes, who are generous but dedicated to the idea of keeping alive that particular tradition. More than that, I can't really say, I'm afraid. I'd love to know more about whether Italians and Portuguese people and Bulgarians are philanthropic, but I just don't know enough to be able to say.
Might have to have a part 2 conversation on that.
I would just say that to date, we probably don't have a long enough history with a large enough international student population at Emory that have themselves been out in the community and establishing themselves and creating their own sources of revenue and wealth to be significant donors. We try to inculcate, even in undergraduates, a sense of the university as important in their lives and something that they want to stay connected to, including with some degree of philanthropy. And I think the jury is still out on whether some of the cultural traditions and interests of international students and where they end up spending their time, whether they end up living in America afterwards or returning to their home countries, how all that will play out over the years in philanthropy remains to be seen.
Yeah.
So true, Susan, and a great segue into closing as we approach the 2 o'clock hour here in the United States for those who are joining from around the world, whatever the time is in your home. But that's a big part of the role that I have as our Executive Director of International Advancement and Constituent Engagement, a relatively new role here for the university. And I'm learning as I build this program who our alumni are around the world and what are some of the cultural differences, and who are some of our alumni who are Americans living as expats and how they're contributing and giving back philanthropically. And it's a fascinating role, and I'm just delighted that we've been able to even touch upon it a little bit here, that part of the conversation as part of this dialogue, and was one of the reasons why I invited Patrick to have this conversation, and you, Susan, as a member member of our board of trustees for many years, and sitting in your role on the advancement committee. A lot more conversation to have. As Lane said, we could have a whole other session. I think we could have a whole series of sessions discussing this, and I think that the future holds a lot of opportunity, and a lot of questions will be answered as I continue in this role. And I thank you both so much, because I think this is really the beginning of longer conversations that we'll be having on campus with leadership, with our volunteer leadership around philanthropy to support the university globally. And I'm really excited about the role that I play now in this position, and just thank you guys so much for your insights, and look forward to additional conversations. So without further ado, as we are now right at the top of the hour, I want to thank again Susan and Patrick, and thank you all for joining from all over the world. I know we have people registered from many parts of the globe. And if you're in the UK, I just want to remind you again, since we had this partly hosted by our volunteer leadership in the UK as well, to please look out for additional programming that we have in the UK, thanks to the hard work of Alicia and Layla and all the other volunteers there. We have 20 active networks around the world, and you can find more information about that on the Alumni Association website, or always feel free to contact me directly if you'd like to find out more ways to get involved in your local chapter in your local community globally. Please also look out for future digital events. You can find a full list of all of our international programs, including recordings of all of our past webinars at engage.emory.edu/international programs. And our next program will actually be September the 4th at 9 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time. It's entitled Health and Healthcare in the Pandemic, Brazil and the United States, a collaboration between the Emory Brazil Network and the Allitt Institute, which is part of our Office of Global Strategy and Initiatives. This brings our presentation to a close today, and I want to again thank everybody for participating, and look out for more digital programs. Hope you can join us on the 4th. And again, thanks so much to Susan and Patrick, and everybody stay safe and well.
Thank you.
Thank you.